At dinner, my daughter looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'm ashamed to have a father like you." I didn't say a single word back to her. 3 days later, her mother sent one text message to the wrong group chat, and by the time everyone finished reading it, my daughter understood exactly who her father really was. My name is David Foster. I'm 49 years old, and I live outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I own a commercial equipment leasing company that I built from a single forklift rental almost 20 years ago. But you'd never guess that from looking at me. I still wear the same faded ball caps I've worn since my 20s. I still drive a 10-year-old pickup with a dent in the tailgate I never bothered to fix. And I never once talked about money in front of my daughter. My daughter Ella is 15 years old, and she's lived with her mother Karen since our divorce 5 years ago. Every other weekend, without fail, I pick her up Friday afternoon and drop her back Sunday night. It's the one thing in my life that has never wavered, not once in 5 years. That Friday started off like any other one, but by the time it ended, my daughter's whole picture of who I was had come apart at the seams, and it wasn't me who tore it down. Karen and I were married for 13 years before it fell apart. There wasn't one big blow-up that ended it. It was slower than that, a kind of erosion where two people simply stopped being able to reach each other. I was the quiet type, always had been, the kind of man who spent his days managing equipment contracts and came home content to just sit on the porch. Karen wanted more noise in her life, more attention, more of a feeling that something exciting was always just around the corner. I never held that against her. I just wasn't built to give her that, and I never pretended to be someone I wasn't. When we split, I made sure Ella never felt like she was standing in the middle of a war zone. I paid child support early every single month, never late, not once. I never said a critical word about Karen in front of our daughter, and I showed up every other weekend, like the sun coming up, rain or shine, work deadlines or not. Karen met Blake about a year and a half after our divorce was finalized. He ran a small marketing consulting business, or at least that's what he called it whenever the subject came up. He drove a leased German sedan that got traded in for a newer one almost every year, wore expensive watches, and always had a story about some big client he'd just landed. Karen married him about 10 months later, and Ella moved with them into a much nicer house on the west side of town, the kind of place with a circular driveway and a 3-car garage. I never said a bad thing about Blake to Ella, not once, even as she started coming back from her mother's house with stories about vacations to the coast, a new phone every year, and a bedroom that looked like something out of a magazine. I told myself a kid comparing 2 households was normal, and that it didn't matter what Ella thought of me as long as I kept showing up. Our custody arrangement gave Karen the school weeks and gave me every other weekend, along with holidays. We split evenly. I never fought Karen over money or property in the divorce, even though my attorney told me at the time I had grounds to push harder on a few things. I just wanted it settled, fast and clean, so Ella could get back to a normal routine as quickly as possible. Looking back now, I think that same quiet approach is exactly what let a man like Blake walk into the picture 2 years later and slowly rewrite the story of who the real steady presence in Ella's life was supposed to be. That Friday, Karen texted me and asked if I minded if Blake and Ella's stepbrother, Cole, joined us for the first hour of my weekend, since Blake wanted, in her words, a chance to actually get to know me better, instead of just hearing about me secondhand. I agreed, because I never wanted Ella to sense any tension between the adults in her life. We met at a rooftop restaurant downtown that Blake picked out, one of those places with candlelight and small plates that cost more than a full meal anywhere else in the city. Blake showed up in a blazer with no tie, shook my hand a little harder than necessary, and spent the first 15 minutes talking about a new client contract he said he'd just closed for 6 figures. Ella sat next to him the whole time, laughing at his jokes, nodding like every word out of his mouth carried weight. About halfway through dinner, the conversation drifted to what everyone had been up to that week. I mentioned in passing that I'd been tied up finalizing a new equipment contract for a construction outfit expanding into the Piedmont area. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary talk. Blake jumped in almost immediately and started describing describing a deal he claimed he'd landed with a regional retail chain, how his business partner had called him the closer in front of the whole office, how he was already looking at a lake house for next summer. Ella was hanging on every word, the same way she always did when Blake talked about money. Then, out of nowhere, she looked directly at me and said it loud enough that 2 nearby tables could hear. "Honestly, Dad, I'm ashamed to have a father like you. Blake actually built something. You just exist." The table went silent. Karen's face went pale. Blake looked down at his plate like he'd suddenly discovered something fascinating about the arrangement of his food. I sat there for a moment, looking at my daughter, and I felt something shift deep inside my chest, but I didn't let a trace of it show on my face. A server walked past right at that moment and refilled our water glasses like nothing at all had happened. And for a few seconds, the sound of the pitcher against the glass was the only noise at that table. Blake finally looked up, gave a small, uncomfortable smile like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or say something, and went back to cutting his food. Karen opened her mouth, closed it again, then reached for her wine glass. Instead of actually saying anything to her daughter, I noticed every bit of it, every small gesture, and I filed it away without reacting out loud to any of it. I could have said plenty in that moment. I could have told Ella exactly what I do for a living, how many employees are on my payroll, what my company is actually worth compared to a consulting business that, as far as I could tell, existed mostly in conversation. I could have humiliated Blake right there at that table with facts he clearly had no idea I was sitting on. But I didn't say any of it. I just looked at Ella and said, "Okay, let's finish eating." And I steered the conversation toward her upcoming volleyball tournament instead. Karen tried, weakly, to tell Ella that wasn't a kind thing to say. But it came out soft, almost apologetic, like some part of her actually agreed with what our daughter had just said out loud. Blake never corrected Ella either. He just sat there, looking quietly satisfied with himself, like he'd won something without lifting a finger. The rest of that first hour passed quietly. I paid for my share of the meal, hugged Ella when Karen and Blake said their goodbyes, and Ella and I drove off toward my place for the rest of the weekend. She was unusually cheerful in the car, chattering about her tournament, seemingly having already forgotten what she'd said at the table. I hadn't forgotten. I don't think I ever would. That night, once Ella was asleep in her room, I sat alone in my kitchen with the lights off. For a long time, I kept replaying her words. "I'm ashamed to have a father like you. Blake actually built something." I wasn't angry at her. Not really. She's 15, and kids absorb whatever gets praised around them at home. But I was done being quiet about certain things. Not to punish my daughter, but because I realized I had let an entire family believe a version of my life that simply wasn't true. And I'd let that version sit unchallenged for far too long. What Ella didn't know, what Karen didn't fully understand, and what Blake absolutely did not know was exactly how much of their comfortable life was quietly connected to me without any of them ever realizing it. And that night, sitting in that dark kitchen, I decided it was time they found out. Not through anger, but through the simple truth finally being allowed to surface. Here's something I never once mentioned at that dinner table, or any dinner table. Almost 20 years ago, I started my leasing company with one rented forklift and a loan co-signed by my late father. By the time Karen and I separated, that company had grown into something with real substance behind it, supplying and financing heavy equipment for construction and logistics firms across 3 states. I kept all of it quiet on purpose. I never wanted Ella growing up thinking money was the measuring stick for anything. And I never wanted Karen chasing more than what was fair in our divorce, simply because she discovered what the business had actually become. But here's the part that mattered most. 3 years ago, before Karen ever married Blake, she'd called me asking for a favor. Blake's consulting business had hit a rough patch. Some clients had walked, and he needed someone with an established commercial credit history to guarantee a small business line of credit so he could keep his office lease and cover payroll for his 2 employees through a slow quarter. Karen swore it was a one-time thing, and for Ella's sake, I quietly agreed and put my name on that guarantee. Around that same period, a property manager I used for a group of commercial and residential units I owned through a holding company called Piedmont Ridge Properties happened to lease out a house on the west side of town, the very house Karen and Blake eventually moved into. I never asked who the tenants would be, and my property manager never mentioned it to me either. Not until months later, when I saw the address on a routine ownership report and realized exactly whose name was on that lease. And on top of all of that, Blake's marketing consulting firm had, for the past 2 years, held a modest retainer contract with my leasing company to manage our regional social media presence, a contract I had approved without ever once meeting with him directly, since my operations manager handled those vendor relationships. None of them knew any of this. Not Karen, not Blake, not Ella. I had never used any of it, never even considered using it, until that Friday night on the rooftop. The next morning, I called my accountant, a woman named Sandra, who's handled my books for over 15 years, and asked her to compile everything connected to that credit guarantee and the retainer contract with Blake's firm. I also called my property manager, a man named Lewis, who runs Piedmont Ridge Properties' daily operations, and asked him to pull the lease details for that specific house on the west side of town. I wasn't loud about any of it, and I didn't raise my voice on a single call that day. I simply started asking the kinds of questions I probably should have asked a long time ago, like why my name was still sitting on a credit guarantee for a man who, based on everything he'd been bragging about at dinner, clearly didn't need my help anymore. By that afternoon, I had a full, clear picture of exactly how much of Blake's stability quietly rested on decisions I had made out of nothing but consideration for my daughter's comfort. I sat with all of it for one more night before I did anything, because I wanted to be certain I wasn't acting purely out of hurt. By Monday morning, I realized I wasn't hurt anymore. I was simply finished. Monday, I called Louis first. I asked him directly what the lease situation looked like for that house. He told me the lease was actually up for renewal in 3 weeks, since it operated on a rolling annual term. Normally, renewals happened automatically unless the owner instructed otherwise. I told him not to renew it. Told him to send the standard non-renewal notice required under North Carolina law, giving the full legal notice period. Nothing rushed, nothing improper, simply a property owner's decision not to continue a lease. Lewis didn't ask why. He said he'd have the notice prepared and sent that same week. Tuesday, I called Sandra about the credit guarantee. She confirmed exactly what I suspected, that Blake's business credit had never actually recovered the way his stories at dinner tables suggested. My name on that guarantee was the only reason the lender had extended the line of credit in the first place, and at a rate far better than Blake would have qualified for a loan. Sandra explained that if I formally requested removal as guarantor, the lender was required to reassess the credit line based solely on Blake's business financials. If his business didn't independently qualify, the lender could reduce the credit limit sharply or call the balance due for reassessment. I told her to file the request that day. This wasn't a loophole or a trick. It's simply how guaranteed credit lines work, and any lender will confirm the same thing. By Wednesday, the bank had already reached out to Blake directly, informing him his guarantor had been removed and that his available credit would be reevaluated and likely reduced within a short window. I only found out about this part later, but at the time, all I knew was that the pieces were already moving. Wednesday afternoon, I made one more call, this time to a woman named Renee Castillo, my operations manager, who handled all vendor contracts, including the social media retainer with Blake's firm. I asked her, purely out of curiosity, how satisfied our regional managers actually were with the work Blake's team had been delivering. Renee, without any prompting from me, mentioned that engagement numbers had been flat for 2 straight quarters, and that 2 regional managers had already asked about exploring other vendors when the contract came up for renewal at the end of the month. I told her that if performance genuinely hadn't been meeting expectations, she should make whatever decision made sense for the company, entirely independent of any personal relationship I might have to the vendor. Renee said she'd handle it through the normal review process, exactly as she would with any other contract. I hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, understanding fully now how much of Blake's polished image had been quietly resting on arrangements that were never actually his to claim credit for. Thursday, Ella called me, sounding confused, saying Blake had been on his phone all day, looking stressed, and that her mother kept saying everything was fine, even though she clearly didn't seem fine at all. I kept my voice calm and steady with Ella, told her that grown-up situations sometimes get complicated, and asked her about her volleyball practice instead. I wasn't going to put any of what was unfolding onto my daughter's shoulders, no matter what came next. That same evening, Karen texted me, asking if I'd heard anything about issues with their house lease, since she'd just received a notice in the mail about non-renewal. I told her, honestly, that I hadn't heard anything about her receiving it, which was true, even though I already knew it was coming. She mentioned how strange the timing felt, getting hit with a lease non-renewal the same week Blake's business credit line had apparently been slashed without warning. I told her that did sound stressful and left it there. I want to be honest. Sitting on that information without saying anything felt uncomfortable, but I also kept remembering sitting at that rooftop table days earlier, listening to my own daughter tell me she was ashamed of me, while the two adults responsible for guiding her said absolutely nothing to correct it. So, I let that week continue exactly the way it was, already moving, without pushing anything further, and without lifting a single finger to slow any of it down either. Friday morning, before I was set to pick Ella up for our weekend, Karen called me, and her voice sounded nothing like her usual composed self. She said the property management company had confirmed the lease truly wasn't renewing, and, with Blake's business credit line suddenly restricted and two of his biggest ongoing contracts apparently in jeopardy, they weren't sure how they were going to manage the next few months, let alone find a new place to live on short notice. Then she said something that told me she'd started connecting pieces on her own, without any help from me. She mentioned that Lewis, the property manager, had casually referenced during a phone call that the actual owner behind the house was a company called Piedmont Ridge Properties. Karen, out of simple curiosity, looked up the company's public filings and found my name listed as the registered owner behind the holding company. Her voice cracked slightly when she asked me straight out if I owned the house they'd been living in for the last 2 years. I didn't deny it. I told her the truth. Calmly, the same way I'd handled every call that week, I told her yes, I'd owned it through that company for years, long before she and Blake had ever moved in, and that neither Lewis nor I had known who the tenants would be until it was already settled. She went quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question I knew was eventually coming. She asked if any of what was happening, the lease, Blake's credit line, his business troubles, had anything to do with me, asking what was going on. And I could hear the panic sitting just underneath Karen's voice, even as she tried to sound composed, for our daughter's sake. For a brief second, I nearly felt sorry for her, standing in a kitchen that wasn't even really hers to begin with, holding a phone while her whole arrangement shifted beneath her in the span of 1 week. But then I remembered that same kitchen, that same family, sitting silently while my daughter told me to my face that she was ashamed of me, and the sympathy I felt only stretched so far. I answered her honestly. I told her I hadn't done anything illegal or underhanded. I had simply stopped quietly propping up parts of a life that were never supposed to be my responsibility to carry in the first place, especially after watching my own daughter say what she said at that dinner table, while neither she nor Blake said a single word to correct it. Karen was silent on the line for a long stretch. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking, and she admitted she hadn't known Blake's credit line had ever depended on my guarantee, that he'd never told her the full story of how he'd secured it 3 years earlier. She said she also hadn't realized the house was connected back to me, and that if she had known any of it, she never would have let Ella say what she said, without correcting her immediately. I told her I believed her, and I meant it, because Karen has never been a cruel person, just someone who sometimes doesn't look closely enough at the people and arrangements she trusts. She asked, almost pleading, if there was anything I could do to help, since they now had limited time to find new housing, and Blake's business situation was unraveling at the same time. I told her honestly that the lease decision and the credit situation were already in motion through completely normal legal and financial channels, already placed in the hands of my property manager and accountant, and that I wasn't in a position to simply reverse decisions that had been properly and lawfully made. I told her I was sorry she was scared, but that none of this had ever really been about her. She stayed quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to find some argument that might change my mind. There wasn't one, and some part of her already seemed to understand that. Before we hung up, I told her the one thing I actually cared about saying out loud. I told her that whatever happened between her and Blake going forward, none of it would change a single thing about my time with Ella, and that she didn't need to worry about that part at all. Something else happened that Friday afternoon, something that ended up mattering more than anything I'd set in motion myself. Karen, clearly overwhelmed trying to manage the lease notice, Blake's unraveling finances, and her own nerves all at once, sent a long text meant for her sister, venting about everything that had happened that week. In it, she wrote plainly that she'd always known, deep down, that Blake's success was mostly appearance, that David had quietly been the one guaranteeing his credit line for 3 years, that David also apparently owned the house they were living in, and that she felt sick, realizing Ella had humiliated the one parent who had actually been holding their whole family structure together without ever asking for credit or recognition. Except Karen didn't send that message to her sister. In her stress, she sent it to the family group chat instead, the same group chat that included Ella, Blake, Blake's mother, and Karen's own parents. By the time Karen realized her mistake and tried to delete it, 3 people had already read it, including Ella. I found out about all of this only when Ella called me, 20 minutes later, crying in a way I had never once heard from her. Not through the divorce, not through any hard moment in the 5 years since. She said she'd read the message before her mother could take it down. She said she finally understood that the vacations, the new phone every year, the big house with the circular driveway, none of it had ever really come from Blake at all. She said she felt sick realizing what she had said to me at that rooftop table in front of him, while I sat there and said absolutely nothing back. I told her, calmly, that I wasn't angry with her, and I meant that completely. I told her that 15-year-olds repeat what gets praised around them, and that none of what happened that week was ever meant to hurt her directly. I told her the truth, in a way I hoped she could actually carry with her, that being loud about success doesn't make someone successful. That showing up every single weekend for 5 straight years, paying every bill on time, never once saying an unkind word about her mother, that was the real measure of a man. even if it never once got mentioned out loud at any dinner table. Ella went quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said she was sorry. Real quiet. Real serious. The kind of sorry that actually meant something, coming from a kid who had just had her whole understanding of her family rearranged in a single afternoon. I still picked her up that Friday evening for our regular weekend, because whatever was unraveling between the adults, I wasn't going to let it touch the one thing that had never wavered in 5 years. We went to a small diner near her school, instead of anywhere fancy, just a booth by the window. She was unusually quiet the whole ride there, and about halfway through her meal, she asked me directly if everything happening at her mother's house had anything to do with me. I decided she deserved the truth, explained in a way a 15-year-old could genuinely understand. I told her that 3 years ago, I'd helped guarantee a credit line for Blake because her mother had asked me to, and that I also happened to own the house they were renting, though none of us had realized that connection until recently. I told her plainly that I'd chosen to step back from quietly supporting those arrangements after she told me, in front of Blake, that she was ashamed to have a father like me, and that Blake never once said a word to correct her. Ella's face went pale, and she set down her fork. She said she hadn't known any of that, and that she'd only said what she said because Blake was always talking about his deals and his success, and it made my quiet, steady life seem small by comparison. I told her I understood, and that I wasn't upset with her, not even slightly. I told her again that being loud about money has never once made anyone successful, and that the quiet, consistent people in a family are usually the ones actually holding everything together, even when nobody claps for it or writes it down anywhere. 3 weeks later, Karen and Ella moved into a smaller apartment across town, one Karen found completely on her own, with no connection to me or any company I own. Blake's consulting business lost its 2 largest remaining clients within a month, largely due to his own inability to deliver once the financial pressure mounted, and he eventually closed the business altogether and moved back in with relatives 2 states away. Karen didn't go with him. I never gloated about any part of it, not to Karen, not to Ella, and certainly not to Blake, who I never spoke to again after that rooftop dinner. Ella comes to my place every other weekend still, the same as always, though lately she's started asking to come by on random weekday evenings too, just to sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular. She's never once called me a loser, ashamed, or anything close to it again, though honestly, I never needed her to take the words back. For my own sake, I needed her to understand something that actually matters, that the quiet, steady people in your life are usually the foundation everything else stands on, whether or not anyone ever notices. Karen and I still talk sometimes, mostly about Ella's school events or doctor's appointments, kept simple and respectful. Nothing more than a functioning co-parenting relationship requires. She never brought up the house or the credit line again after that one difficult phone call, and honestly, neither did I. I think back often to that rooftop table, to the sound of the water pitcher clinking against the glasses in the silence after my daughter said what she said. For years, I told myself that staying quiet about what I'd built, what I actually had, what I actually meant to that family, whether they realized it or not, was the right way to protect Ella from growing up thinking money was the point of anything. I still believe that, mostly. But I learned something else that week too, something I hadn't fully understood before. Staying quiet doesn't just protect people from the wrong lessons. Sometimes, it lets them learn the wrong lessons anyway, just from someone else. someone louder, someone with less behind their words than they let on. I don't think Ella ever sat down and did the math on Blake, the way I eventually had to do the math on myself. She just absorbed what got celebrated in that house. The vacations, the new phone every year, the way Blake talked about deals like they were trophies. Kids do that. They watch what gets praised, and they repeat it. And none of that ever made her a bad kid. It just meant she needed to see the other side of the ledger eventually. The part nobody had shown her yet. Some weekends now, after dinner, Ella and I just sit out on the porch for a while, not talking about much of anything. She'll ask about a shipment I'm tracking, or how a new lease deal is going. Small, ordinary questions that she never used to ask before. I don't think she's trying to prove anything to me when she asks. I think she's just genuinely curious now, in a way she wasn't before, about what a quiet, steady life actually looks like up close instead of from a distance. I built my whole life around showing up rather than showing off, and it took one hard sentence at a dinner table and one honest mistake by her mother to finally let my own daughter see the difference between the two. I don't know that I would have chosen to have it happen quite that way if I'd had any say in it, but I've stopped wishing it had gone differently. Some truths only land when they arrive on their own timing, not on ours. If you made it this far into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more stories like this one coming. Real families, real situations, and the kind of quiet truths that nobody sees coming until they're already sitting right in front of everyone.